I'm Nintendo.
And I'm Sega. This is Console Wars!
Welcome to ESPN Infinity, the sports network for games that no one watches. I'm James.
And I'm Carl.
And oh boy, have we got a show for you tonight, folks.
I'll say we took that 90s rivalry, the Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo, on ice. I'm talking hockey.
And what a disaster of a match that was. But you can't blame the players. You have to look at the coaching.
That's right. How these two ever got coaching jobs is beyond me.
Hey, it wasn't that bad.
I thought it was better than when we did football. Without further ado, let's take a look at these highlights that play more like lowlights.
Should be a doozy. We start with a pregame warm-up, members of Team Nintendo stretching, Kid Chameleon on Team Sega puts a mask on and turns into Jason and tries killing everyone.
Well, let's just be thankful he didn't put on a mask of my ex-wife.
Hi-oh! Now here's Sketch from Team Sega taking a shot and he's down!
Well, everyone who's ever played Comic Zone knows he gets hurt when he hits inanimate objects. Proving Sketch is the dumbest video game character ever.
Now here's Earthworm Jim without a stick. He's about to be clobbered by Kid Chameleon, but then he uses his worm body and scores!
Well, that's what I call using your head.
Here's Echo the Dolphin with a penalty shot, but he can't stop shivering and he flops it.
I'll tell you, those mammals just are not made for cold weather. That'll teach you to credit card me with a dorsal fin again.
Up next we have Axel of Team Sega. He has the puck, but then throws his stick into the face of Sketch.
His own teammate should have known Axel would throw it. The man likes to do things with his fist.
Here's Rio from Art of Fighting. He tries to do a knuckle puck, and it fails horribly. Then taken out by Booger Man.
Just like Rio to steal someone else's move and do it poorly.
Here's Booger Man flying across the ice with his flaming flatulence, and he cracks the ice as everyone falls into a pool of water.
And that's going to end the game. A rematch will be scheduled for later this week.
Okay, that was worse than I remember.
Yep, that's why I blocked it out with the drinking.
I don't know how he did so bad. I used to play NHL 94 all the time. Well, for the Sega Genesis.
I used to play NHL 94 all the time too, but for the Super Nintendo.
What? That's it? Are we doing this?
Did Bill Finger name Bruce Wayne, Batman's alter ego, after historical figures Robert the Bruce, a Scottish national hero, and Mad Anthony Wayne, a hero of the American Revolution? Yes!
Best NHL 94.
NHL 94 is a hockey game by EA Sports. It's the third game of the NHL series franchise. It received critical acclaim and has been hailed as one of the greatest sports games of all time. It is still highly regarded today with the online community at NHL94online.com. They even hold tournaments, which, as this is being recorded, will be their 9th one, this September in Toronto.
Games are made for Sega CD and DOS. Even versions called NHL 94 Rewind were released for PS4 and Xbox One with updated rosters. Today we're looking at the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis versions. They're very similar, but were developed separately, giving us many differences. Which one's better? Let's find out.
These games look pretty similar.
There's not much to look at graphically. You have your players, team logos, puck, ice, and crowd. Characters are small, so there's not really much detail. Overall, very simple designs.
There is one glaring difference.
The ice on Super Nintendo is mostly white with a hint of blue, pretty much the way you'd expect ice to look. The Sega, on the other hand, is blue-green. Limitations of the colors on Sega couldn't quite give it that natural ice color. It's not horrible, but it does look like you're skating on a swimming pool.
Ice isn't a big deal. You know what it is, though? The players.
Characters in both games look the same, but the Sega game does have a little more detail on the faces, particularly the eyes. It's not much, just some dots, really simple, but you can clearly see eyes on the players. The color may be lighter depending on the team, but they're there. The Super Nintendo game, on the other hand, no eyes. Their faces are just blank canvases. Occasionally, you may see eyes on one player, but that's about it. Sega games got eyes.
How hard did you have to squint to see that? I have way more noticeable differences with the players. More animations.
In both games, the players have celebration animations, the most common one being raising their sticks and arms up. But the Super Nintendo has more. I'm talking arm pumping. Got low arm pumping, one-legged arm pumping, no arm pumping on Sega.
So I have fewer player animations. You have like a weird glitch in your crowd.
Sometimes when you look at the crowd on Super Nintendo, you see these weird gray squares with random dots. They come and go. They just look like a glitch. Sega game doesn't have these weird squares.
Again, something you barely notice. My crowd does more than yours.
The crowd at the bottom of the screen is just silhouettes for both games. Sometimes when you score a goal on Super Nintendo, they stand up and cheer. They never stand up on Sega. Ever.
You really think your crowd's better?
One thing the crowd does on Sega is take pictures. You see flashes from the cameras quite often. The crowds on Super Nintendo never take pictures. No flash photography on Super Nintendo. The crowd also moves in both games. They move their arms or stand up, but the crowd on Sega has more animations. The people in Sega actually walk around. Check out these guys walking to their seats. You don't see anything like that on Super Nintendo.
Still, most of your stuff you don't even see while you're playing.
Okay, what about this? Your game is more choppy.
The character animations on Sega are much more fluid than Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo is much more choppy. You can really see this when you just have one player on the screen. Sega game just has those smoother character animations.
It's close, but the smoother animations gives my game the edge.
For having more detailed looking characters, better crowd, and smoother animations, best graphics go to Sega Genesis.
Presentation for these games is very simple.
Your HUD is just your score and time with an EA logo. There's always a star around your player and whoever has the puck. The puck is always the center of focus, so if you're off screen, there's an arrow to show your position.
That's only the HUDs. Everything else is much better on Super Nintendo.
Look at the title screens. On Super Nintendo, all the logos pop up. Then you get a puck flying at you with the various team logos. Exciting stuff. On Sega, just a still image. It's not that fun.
Well, I have something you're missing.
In between periods, both games give you the score, access to any stats, and the scores of other hockey games. In the regular season, if you leave the Sega game idle, you actually see some of the highlights from these other games. You don't get regular season highlights on Super Nintendo.
I mean, it's still not as impressive as my menus.
The menu layouts are fairly different. One noticeable difference is the crowd meter. On Sega, it's just numbers. On Super Nintendo, you actually see a decibel reader. The Super Nintendo game also has team and league logos everywhere. Sega does not. The biggest difference, though, is the player profile pics. On Super Nintendo, their pictures are in color. On Sega, black and white. Boring. Just like Sega's manuals.
Then there's the matchup screen.
Ron Barr gives you a little summary of the two teams before a matchup. On Super Nintendo, you see him sitting there at his desk. He even has a little EA coffee mug. On Sega, he's just a small profile picture. And again, player pics are black and white on Sega. Nice and colorful on Super Nintendo.
Yeah, but you are missing something there.
On Sega, the matchup screen tells you which players are hot or cold. The Super Nintendo does not.
Yeah, real sorry I don't have that. Besides, you're still missing things.
The pause menu is very similar, but look closer. On Super Nintendo, you see the announcers. On Sega, no announcers. You can even see them on Super Nintendo while you're playing. They're not there at all on Sega.
The Super Nintendo presentation's much prettier.
For having an exciting title screen, sharper menu, colorful player profile pictures, the full Ron bar, and announcers, best presentation goes to Super Nintendo.
sounds a little different.
We had different people working on it.
Music on Super Nintendo was by Michael J. Sakirka.
The music on Sega was by Rob Hubbard.
These songs have more of a kick on Super Nintendo.
The music during my gameplay sounds pretty good.
Dieter Rule gets credit for the organ music in both games. It comes and goes, just like in a real hockey game. On Super Nintendo, the organ sounds more broken or staccato. On Sega, the sound of the organ sustains better.
But your clapping sounds like punches.
The organ still sounds good.
Let's get into sound effects.
Sound effects on Super Nintendo were by Jeff Dyke. Listen to the crowd. On Super Nintendo, when they're quiet, they sound like a crowd. On Sega, quiet crowd sounds like the ocean. Plus, I have an exclusive voiceover.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
Don't have that on Sega.
My sound effects are definitely better.
Sound effects on Sega were by Rob Hubbard, who did the music. When the crowd is cheering, it sounds pretty natural. The Super Nintendo sounds like they're playing audience audio through speakers. Slap shots on Sega are so satisfying. On Super Nintendo, they're okay. On Sega, when you hit an opponent, the grunting is nice and pronounced. So satisfying. On Super Nintendo, it's not as crisp.
I like my music.
I like my sound effects.
Ty.
Super Nintendo has better music.
Sega has better sound effects.
Neither game sounds bad.
And neither game stands out.
Best sound is a tie.
There's a lot of similarities to gameplay.
There's lots of different controls for the different positions. One button for pass, one button to flip, and one button for shooting the puck. Tap the shoot button for a wrist shot, hold the shoot button for a slap shot.
On defense, you have one button for hooks, holds, one button to poke, check, trip, or switch to the closest player, and one button for speed burst or body check.
You can also play as the goalie, who has various controls with and without the puck.
There's a lot you can do in these games. So many different techniques to score on offense. I won't list them all here, but there's a lot. One of the more notable techniques are one-timers. So many techniques give the gameplay a lot of depth. Defense has plenty of different strategies as well. A game that can be simple for beginners, but has a lot of depth for veterans.
And that's just the controls. There's also different game modes.
You have the regular season, playoffs, best of 7 playoffs, shootout, and even a demo mode.
You can also customize things, whether you want to be the home or the away team, length of the period, whether penalties and line changes are on or off, and whether goalie is automatic or manual.
And the entire time you have access to stats. You can view these on the pause screen or in between periods.
Very similar games with a lot going on.
But my game's got more. Let's start with the multiplayer.
Both games can play 2-player. Both games can even use the multi-tabs for more players. Sega can have 4 players, Super Nintendo can have 5.
Extra players is cool, but I have a larger roster.
Sega has the expansion team's goalies in the game twice. For example, John Van Beesbrook is on the New York Rangers and Florida Panthers. On Super Nintendo, he's only on the Florida Panthers.
So some players are on two teams. I can do so many more things you can't.
Let's talk about switching players. Both games can do it somewhat randomly with the push of a button. On Super Nintendo, you can be more precise. You can use L or R to select defensemen to your left or right. You can't do that on Sega. Also, selecting the goalie. You have to hold down the button on Sega to do it. On Super Nintendo, you can do it much faster with a single push of a button. Also, exiting a game. It's easy on Super Nintendo. Simply pause and select Exit Game. It'll take you back to the menu. You don't have that on Sega. You want to leave the game? You have to get up and hit reset. What is this? The Middle Ages?
So I can do something you can't. Let's check out the instant replay.
Both games have instant replay. You can fast forward, rewind, play frame by frame, and move around the ice. However, the Sega game gives you a reverse angle option view. Can't do that on Super Nintendo.
So what, your game has bugs?
So does yours.
Yeah, but your game is loaded with them.
Both these games have bugs. There's too many to list here, however, the Sega game does have more bugs than the Super Nintendo.
Okay, my game's more buggy, but it doesn't ruin my game.
You have one significant bug.
Let's talk about the weight bug. When two players are different weights, the heavier player can knock over the lighter player. Makes sense to me. And that's how it works in the Super Nintendo game. But it works differently in the Sega game. Actually, quite the opposite. The Sega game has a major bug where the light players can knock over heavy players. Heavy players can't knock over light players. How did that happen?
Okay, it's a bad bug, but only when you control the player.
When AI is controlling a player, the heavier characters do knock over the lighter ones. You can actually develop this into a strategy. You start by checking a player, and then switch characters mid-check, and the AI will follow the rules of the heavier player, taking out the lighter one. Now both light and heavy players can check people.
It's a bug. Don't justify it with strategy.
Still, despite the exclusives you have in your game and the bugs in my gameplay is still better.
How?
That's easy. The frame rate.
The Super Nintendo game runs at about 20 frames per second. The Sega game runs at least 30 frames per second and possibly even 60 frames per second. So not only does it look smoother, it plays that way too. All the Super Nintendo exclusives, 5 players, switching with the shoulder buttons, exiting the game, they all pale in comparison to the much smoother frame rate. Do you want to play the choppy hockey game or the smooth one that really makes you feel like you're flying on the ice?
But my game's still loaded with more.
It's still missing things.
Let's talk records. Another way the Sega version outdoes the Super Nintendo game is how it keeps records of everything. This is because the Sega game allows you to save up to 7 files. The Sega game is able to record user records and player records. You can't save any stats on Super Nintendo. Also, playoffs. The playoffs are saved on Sega as well. On Super Nintendo, you need to use a password, and it's a long password. Also, speaking of records, whenever you score a goal in both games, they show you who scored and who assisted. Sega, however, also shows you how many times each player scored or assisted. Super Nintendo game doesn't do that.
It's really close, but you just can't beat that smooth frame rate.
For having a larger roster, reverse angles on instant replays, but most importantly, having a much better frame rate and better record keeping, best gameplay goes to Sega Genesis.
Both games are very similar, but one is better, and that game is NHL 94 for the Sega Genesis.
The ice may not be the best color, but it does have more detailed characters, better crowd, and smoother character animations. It's lacking in presentation, but it holds its own when it comes to sound. And it has better gameplay, for having a larger roster, reverse angles on instant replays, but most importantly, having a much better frame rate and better record keeping. The Super Nintendo game's fine. In fairness, it does have many features that the Sega game doesn't. Player records, saving, and smooth gameplay are really what pushed the Sega version over the top. It's kind of like Doom on 32X. Sure, it's missing some things that the Super Nintendo game has, but because it plays so much smoother, it's the better game. Both games are good, but one is better, and that's NHL 94 for the Sega Genesis.
Oh man, I'm feeling good. I am ready for the second game.
We're gonna show them. We'll show them all. There's no way this game could be any worse. And things are worse.
How could this match between Nintendo and Sega be such a disaster?
Let's show you some more of those low lights and find out.
Should be a doozy. Here's Axel racing down the rink. Here's Ryu. They're about to have a massive collision, and Axel holds Ryu and just kind of stays there.
I used to do that stuff all the time with Axel and Blaze. It was sexy then, and it's sexy now.
Here's Batman wide open. Ryu makes a hard pass to him, and Batman takes a puck right to the mouth and gets knocked unconscious.
I bet right about now he's wishing he was wearing those hockey pads.
So here's Ryu attempting another knuckle puck, and it's away! And now Boomerang's back and nails him in the face! And then buddies, buddies, buddies!
I'll tell you, that must be an Australian knuckle puck technique. Because it's like a boomerang.
Oh, I get it. It just wasn't funny. Here's Kid Chameleon again, flying down the ice. He could score, but then hops onto a mysterious platform instead and disappears.
Oh, this is definitely a first for me. Let's just hope he's somewhere nice and in a better place.
Now here's Echo the Dolphin with another penalty shot, and he's trapped under ice.
That also just happens to be my favorite Metallica song.
Damn right. Here's Earthworm Jim without a stick again. Sketchy's about to clobber him. Can Jim repeat the same magic twice? Nope. Ow!
I mean, what else can you really say to that other than, well done. Well done. Well done.
Rio's back at it one more time for the knuckle puck. This time he's charging his spirit gauge and a fire knuckle puck. And it's attacking every single player. Even the coaches.
Ooh, looks like they got hit the hardest too. I wouldn't want to be their faces in the morning. Not a great game, but great entertainment.
Absolutely captivating. Abso-friggin-lutely captivating.
Well, that was a disaster.
Yeah, coaching hockey is definitely not for us. I will not do that again.
Never again. What about baseball?
You read my mind.
Thanks for checking out our latest video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Support us on Patreon for early releases, bonus content, and the Discord. Check out our live channel, Console Wars Live. And special thanks to NHL 94 on Twitter for all their help with this episode. And be sure to check out the online community and tournament if you're a fan of this game. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, X, and Instagram for more Console Wars goodness. Later!
Here's Boogerman flying across the ice with his fire. Here's Boogerman flying across the ice with his fire.
His fire.